Okay, with this video, I'm going to tell you how to distinguish a common gray fox, a red fox, and also how to distinguish the fox from a coyote or a domestic dog. So first, how do you tell if an animal is a fox relative to our other canids? So these two here, we've got a gray fox here and a red fox. If you look at the shape of those skulls, that rostrum in both cases is quite narrow. But if we look at the skulls from this is a coyote here, we'll see that the rostrum is just much more robust. Of course, the domestic dog takes on a variety of different forms. Still, it has a more robust rostrum. And the other trick, which works a fair bit of the time, is that if you look at a domestic dog and you look at the premolars, there's typically not much of a space, or if any, between those premolars. And when you look on any type of wild canid that we have here in Alabama, you're going to see a little bit of a space. Not super prominent there on the coyote, but it's definitely wider than it is in the domestic dog. And turns out that space is pretty prominent here in the gray fox as it is in the red fox. Now, to distinguish the red fox and the gray fox, one of the first things that I look at, which is just I think it's an amazing giveaway, although my example on the right's not a perfect example of this. But as you know, the scientific name or the genus for the gray fox is your scion. And if you look at the temporal ridges here, it makes a nice U. U for your scion. Pretty handy that it worked out that way. Whereas on Vulpes, these temporal ridges typically come back and form a nice V. This one's a little bit more widespread at the base, which makes it a bit confusing, but it's certainly not as wide as it is in the gray fox. So I take that into consideration, but I want you to look at these other variables as well, just for confirmation, because again, this one is not a perfect example of that U versus a V. So other things that you can look at in the gray fox, if you look at the length of the nasal bones versus the maxilla bones, the nasal bone is as long as the maxilla, or maybe a tad bit longer. And when we look at the same in the red fox, the nasal bones are not quite as long when we look at them at the posterior end. The other thing I'd look at is the shape of the postorbital process. And it is much sharper and pointed towards the rear in the red fox and is more triangular in the gray fox. And you'll also notice that there's an indentation behind each of those postorbital processes and is more towards the anterior right there in the red fox and is more towards the posterior and quite deep in the gray fox. There's also a trick for identifying the mandible in each. And if we look at the, this is a gray fox here. This is the angular right here. And there's this little step below the angular that's found in the gray fox. But you're not going to find that in your other Alabama canids. Apparently also occurs in the Arctic fox. But your other canids will not have that. Here's the angular here, and you'll see this just smooth line. So that's how you distinguish your gray fox and your red fox.